Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. The title of this panel is Modern Digital Identity, Plumbing, Policy, and Privacy. I'm honored to be able to moderate it, and for everyone tuning in, I'm grateful for your time. My name is Gilad Rosner, and in terms of the topic, it's something I've been studying and consulting on for over a decade. In the last 20 years, we've seen great change in relation to digital identity, from the birth of EIDs and single sign-on, to advanced federation architectures, hybrid public-private ID systems, mobile identity, and in recent years, the emergence of self-sovereign ID. Digital identity systems are the connective tissue of the internet age, and we have a diverse group of experts here to help us explore how and why such systems are evolving. Joining us on the panel today are John Torpey, Presidential Professor of Sociology and History and Director of the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. He is the author of, among numerous other titles, The Invention of the Passport, Surveillance, Citizenship, and the State. Professor Torpey's far-ranging research explores issues such as how identity papers penetrate the body politic and how the creation of identity systems are part of what it means to be a state. Next is Drummond, who has spent over 2 decades in internet identity, security, privacy, and governance. He joined Evernym as Chief Trust Officer after Evernym acquired Respect Network, where he was co-founder and CEO. At the W3C, he is co-editor of the Decentralized Identifier Specification. At the Trustovp IP Foundation, Drummond is a member of the steering committee and co-chair of the Governance Stack Working Group. At the Sovereign Foundation, he serves as co-chair of the Sovereign Governance Framework Working Group, and for 10 years he served as co-chair of the OASIS XDI Technical Committee, a semantic data interchange protocol that implements privacy by design. Prior to starting Respect Network, Drummond was executive director of 2 industry foundations, the Information Card Foundation and the Open Identity Exchange. In 2002, Drummond received a Digital Identity Pioneer Award from Digital ID World, and in 2013, he was cited as an OASIS Distinguished Contributor. Next is Jan Möller, a senior desk officer at the Federal Ministry of the Interior, Building and Construction in Germany. He's worked in different fields from data protection, e-government and ID documents to digitization strategy and digital sovereignty. Jan was the main author of Germany's EID authorizing law, the Personalausweisgesetz. Before that, he worked for the ULD, the Data Protection Authority of Schleswig-Holstein, and in recent years was a seconded national expert at the EU Commission in the Data Protection and Data Flows Unit. Finally, we have Emma Lindley, an independent advisor, speaker, and writer in identity. She is co-founder of Women in Identity, a not-for-profit organization focused on developing grassroots talent and diversity in the identity industry. Emma also serves on the editorial board for Good ID, the movement towards ethical and humanitarian principles in the field of digital identity. She's been recognized in the Innovate Finance Power List for Women 2016 and 2017, No Identity Top 100 Leaders in Identity, 100 Women in Tech Awards in 2019, and was voted CEO of the Year at No Identity Awards. She has an MBA from Manchester Business School and completed her thesis in competitive strategy in the identity market. Each of the panelists will give 10 minutes of opening remarks, and then we will use the remaining time to take questions from attendees. And so, without further ado, let us please begin with Professor John Torpey.
Thank you, Gilad. Thank you very much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. I'm honored to be among such a distinguished company. And I expect to learn a great deal from the other panelists. I hope I can provide some sort of historical background, I guess, is the basic idea here, since my work really has very little to do with the present very much, but much more to do with how some of these identity or more specifically identification practices developed in the past. So Gilad asked me to talk about the social dimensions of identity papers on the basis of the idea that digital modes of identification have evolved historically from those earlier forms of identification. My work on this topic, which mainly appeared in a book called The Invention of the Passport, mainly focused on documents implicated in regulating movement. And since we have some British participants and perhaps listeners, I should probably also add my collaborative book with the Oxford historian Jane Kaplan called Documenting Individual Identity. I can't remember anymore the title of the subtitle, but it has to do with the development of state practices in the modern world. So in the book that I wrote about passports, it was really an attempt to kind of understand how the idea of nationality was first was implemented and made effective, so to speak. And so I was interested basically in the way this homely little booklet that we carry around sometimes had attained the power to open doors for us or to keep them shut if it was inadequate in some ways, in some way, which of course often they are relative to the borders that you find yourself in front of. It turned out that there was a whole history of these pieces of paper that had been little addressed in previous writing, at least what I could find. And that previous writing tended to focus on laws and policies regarding, migration in the broadest sense, or more specifically in the modern world, the concern is with immigration, entry across borders, international borders, into a space that is not, nationally speaking, one's own. It also turned out that the history of these documents was very contentious, something I hadn't really expected, but they had played a significant role, among other things, in the major revolutions of the modern era, the French, the Russian, and the Chinese. So for example, in the paradigmatic French case, the revolutionaries first decided to get rid of these onerous reminders of the old regime. And here I'm talking mainly about internal passports that were required, often, of course, in the breach, the network of controls and offices for producing these kinds of documents was not necessarily very well developed in, 18th century France. But nonetheless, these were seen often as a kind of indication or reflection of the illiberality of the so-called Ancien Regime. So it was one of the first things the French revolutionaries did, was to get rid of these old documents. But then they were afflicted by counter-revolution, and the leadership of the French Revolution decided. They went back and forth, but they decided, at least at one point, that these restrictive measures had to be reinstituted. They went back and forth, but mainly in the end decided that they needed them in order to defend the revolution and keep it going. So there was, for example, this famous case of King Louis XVI trying to escape in a disguise and with a passport that listed all the people and baggage and dogs and everything that he had with him. So that was a kind of case in which they felt as though their requirement of these documents was vindicated. In any case, having played a substantial part in regulating people's freedom to move, passports, which were, as I say, mostly internal in those days, were widely hated by ordinary people seeking to go about their business. States, however, tended to think it was important to keep tabs on people for a wide variety of reasons: political, religious, economic, medical, in regard to social benefits, etc. And of course, we're living through a period with this coronavirus pandemic where the authority of states to restrict movements is something that is very much on the minds of many of the people listening to this event, I would guess. And some of them facing rather severe kind of constraints on those movements. So this is something that states have wanted to do, have needed to do at different times, sometimes to the benefit of their populations, but it's not necessarily always seen that way. I'm talking from the United States, and I think some of the kinds of restrictions that are currently in force in parts of Europe, would largely be inconceivable here. But in any case, keeping tabs on people meant creating the infrastructure with which to identify them if they were unfamiliar, and to be sure that those identities could be confirmed when necessary. This infrastructure was part of the apparatus that made it possible to rule at a distance, which was an essential part of the development of modern states. This ability to, regulate matters far from the political center, however that might have been understood. And that is, it was essential to policing and taxation as taxation became individualized and sort of stripped out of its community setting, as it was often done before. But it was also crucial to recording benefits to people, that is, being able to identify them. I also soon learned, as I pursued the research for this book, that many forms of identification have been involved in regulating movement, which can, of course, be across the street or around the world. Under the circumstances, the authorities involved in regulating movement can be very disparate in nature. ID cards could be used by policemen to constrain the movements of people at a demonstration, but it is, or at least became, passports that are required in order for people to move across international borders, which are what mainly concern us nowadays. We're less preoccupied with movement, generally speaking, inside of states. We tend to take for granted that there should be freedom to move across public spaces and without ID, so-called ID. In much of Europe and elsewhere, however, it goes without saying that adults at least have to have ID cards. So when I say we tend to take for granted, I mean Americans tend to take that for granted, but Europeans take for granted that you have to have an identity card. It's a legal requirement for many people to have them. But because I was fundamentally concerned with the regulation of movement, I was mainly interested in states and their activities in the area of identification. And it seems to me that this effort to identify individuals by states has been on a more or less steady upward trajectory, although perhaps it's plateauing in a certain sense now. Unless one is suspected of a crime, states have a certain limited interest in who you are, who and what you are. And I'm reminded here, since we have a German fellow panelist from the Interior Ministry, of the story that I discovered in the course of my research of a new passport law that was being adopted by the West German Federal Republic of Germany in 1950, and the Interior Minister spoke in Parliament about this new law, and he began his remarks by saying, well, these are really kind of a waste of time, because good people, right-thinking people will, adhere to the requirements that they have to meet. And it's just the bad people who will sort of circumvent those requirements. So what's the point of these things? But then, of course, he did proceed to shepherd that law through the parliament, and it was duly adopted. So, generally speaking, you don't hear those kinds of stories in our world that people want to get rid of these kinds of restrictions. But, occasionally it has been the case in various points in the past. And now, apropos, public versus private, in the modern world, private entities, of course, also have an interest in identifying people at a distance. For some purposes, those private entities may be concerned less with people's specific identity than with knowing what I might call categorical things about them in order, say, to pitch advertising to them. Once people contract to buy things, however, unless they do so with cash, the seller may be very interested in their specific identities in order to make sure they pay their bills, their credit card bills. Arguably, however, and in contrast to states, there seems to be no limit on what private entities want to know about you and about us. In other words, forms of identification can vary in their scope and nature depending on the identifier and his or her interests. What's striking about digital identity is that it facilitates and promotes the gathering of massive amounts of both specific and categorical knowledge about people, and that this information serves purposes both of buying and selling and of advertising. So digital identification, it seems to me, is a kind of hyper-acceleration and concentration of identification processes that have been centuries in the making. And I'm afraid, Gilad, I lost track of when I started. I'm not sure how much time I have, if any.
That's about 10 minutes right there.
Okay, why don't I wind it up there and turn it over to the rest of the panel, which I very much look forward to hearing.
Great. Thanks a lot, John, for those remarks. And now let's go to Jan Möller.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Gilad, for having me here. And you asked me to give some remarks on official documents and digital ID and how they might be interconnected. And yeah, so maybe let's start with some similarities and differences. I mean, as we heard, official documents didn't have a digital ID by default in earlier times, but for the last 20 years, this came up more and more. And well, sounds as it makes sense because, well, we have an enrollment process for a digital ID, we have an enrollment process for official documents, and we also have a card, a token, and so with a chip nowadays. And so at a certain time, you could ask, well, why not having this? Because we might need it as a state as well, because we have now all these nice e-government especially for this e-government. So yeah, basically this is how it probably all started. And so that meant from the beginning that we have different functions within this card. We had still this ID function by law, basically, where police officers might ask you here in Europe to identify yourself. And so basically you have to do it then and to give it and to present your identity. Also, we have this in the border control context, which nowadays is pretty much standardized in the international context of ICAO. And then we have ID in the e-government process, and where you are presenting your credentials to also the state, but basically for getting some services. And but it's a different situation, also legally. And then we, of course, have a third situation. This is when this ID, this digital ID in a state document, basically is used to be presented to businesses. So we have a third party in here, besides the state on the one hand, and the citizen. So the citizen can present this information, this credentials to businesses. Different legal regimes, interesting also in terms of privacy, obviously. And so we see we have lots of dependencies here between when we have the digital ID connected to official documents. We have in the dependencies field some, well, we could probably talk hours on this one, but just to make some interesting points here. We have, for example, the enrollment process. This includes some certain set of data that you enroll for the state use, but it doesn't mean you have you can have all other credentials there and also can have them checked. I mean, that's one of the differences probably you have, that most of this data which is in the cards is validated in the enrollment process. And of course, we cannot have a free set of data there, but it's limited. And so that might be different in a modern identity, because you might want to have other sets of data in such an ID. So that's a dependency which it's not easy to solve, maybe by linking to another place then to get certain extra credentials, but it cannot be on a card, on the token itself, for example. Other things, so it's dependencies you have is the card validity, basically. Usually you have official documents have a validity of 10 years in Germany. You sometimes have, or very often have, 5 years in other countries. But that's not easy to change, and it makes a big difference in terms of adopting new technology, especially when it comes to the card and the card technology, because you still have old cards and tokens in the field, and maybe if you want to change something, it's new. It's not like you can just change the card validity, because if you do that, let's say from 10 to 5 years, it means doubling the costs as well in the authorities who do the enrollment process, but also for the citizens. So there are dependencies, and also if you look at the format, I mean, when we started with EID in Germany in the national ID card, that was the time when RFID became bigger, and it was decided to use it in the border control context, RFID chips. So it was probably a no-brainer to say, well, we use the same technology for the EID then as well. But nowadays, I mean, this was designed around 2005 to 2008 maybe, and now this was before the time of the iPhone, for example, and nowadays you have more and more IDs directly in secure elements on cell phones, and of course that's a different technology, and if you want to develop further also these digital IDs, this might not be the same time frame you have for national documents. Well, so lots of dependencies. There are more, but let's stay here and go on to maybe to the next field, which is the question of the trust model, which also makes a difference maybe to at least to private digital IDs. Well, identification is always about trust. Trust in the process, for example, the process that the data is validated in the enrollment process and it's correct. That's important for the one who gets the ID data. But as a state, who basically is the monopolist in a certain area, it's also important that you have the trust of the people whose data is actually transferred. So it's not like you can just take it, I mean, maybe for this strictly state use, but if you think of a usage with third parties, businesses, that's definitely a problem. And you have to build trust that the data, which is transferred via a state ID, also meets, let's say, a reasonable expectation of your citizen that you take care of their data. And this basically gives you some limitations in what you can do with it. And that's probably not the same freedom you have if you are designing a private digital ID for a certain company use, let's say. So trust building and the actual trust model is very important. I can say for the German national ID that we felt at the time when we designed it, the need to keep some state control to make sure that third parties who get the data via the national ID card are not misusing it, to keep the trust of the citizen. And basically that let us build a system where we still can make sure that this is not misused. And at the same time, this brings us in a certain ecosystem, which makes it probably more complicated in general, and which doesn't make it easier to for everybody to use. Okay, so that's maybe on the trust model. Maybe then I would like to move on to the question of technology changes. I mean, I said already a little bit on it. National ID cards or passports, they have a long validity. They cost also a lot of money nowadays when you want to get one. And that basically means you don't want to make the validity also not shorter, because this wouldn't make it cheaper for the citizen to get it, for example. On the other hand, you cannot do easily technology changes. If you think about the EKL infrastructure where, let's say, passports are used in our national IDs, e-border gates and other things at the airport, control systems where they check validity and if it's an original document. All this is rolled out worldwide between the states, and so basically this is needs to be a stable technology platform. If you say you would like to go away from this from such a technology for the digital ID, it basically means that either you have a second chip in a card, or you have to go away from the card as the format for the digital ID itself. Maybe this will be one of the developments. We will see. Nobody knows yet, but we see already that we have developments towards IDs on cell phones and secure elements. So technology changes are an important point when it comes to the combination of official documents and digital ID. Maybe also it's a question of what our citizens and users of the ID are used to. I mean, something that you can easily follow with in the national ID cards or national official documents area. So yeah, it would be interesting to see will we see linked IDs? So you have a basic set on for a two-factor authentication still together with the official documents, and then you have further credentials in other areas linked to it to some extent, or will the ID totally move over to another format like cell phones? Yeah, we will see that. But it's an interesting question, which really has lots of put lots of new questions how to design both official documents and then state-driven digital ID. And maybe a last point I would like to make here is the question of infrastructure, or the business model, if you want to say business model. What actually is this identification scheme if a state offers this? As I said in the beginning, digital ID started as something we can have additionally to have e-government supported, at least in Germany it was that way, but also some other states. And so we thought about it as an infrastructure, and but an infrastructure which was most of the costs of this infrastructure could actually were already there because we had this national document, because we had already the card, we had the enrollment process, there had nothing to be added basically. Well, then the costs are bearable. This might be different if you say for the future, this is not the same anymore. We need another enrollment process, or we need a different format, and we need other developments in there. So interesting question. If it's not, well, let's not say for free, but at least it gets more expensive. The question will be who is going to pay for it. Is it still infrastructure cost, which the taxpayer basically pays for, or do we need something like a business model? We have business models in other countries, and some of them didn't work so well either. So yeah, what can we do? Where will we go with it? So
okay,
interesting
Jan,
question.
We're coming to time, so I think that's a great place to leave your talk. Thank you very much. And so now we're going to move on to Drummond Reed.
Thank you, Gilad. Jan has raised a number of questions that I'll be answering. As I try to explain, you asked me on the panel to explain SSI, self-sovereign identity, and verifiable credentials in 10 minutes. So I'm going to try and do that as quickly as I can here. First, I'm gonna set the overall stage by pointing out we've been through 3 years of internet identity. The first one we started with, and that's when we had to figure out just how to do encryption over the internet. And these were the standards and standards bodies involved. Then all the pain of centralized identity meant we needed to move into federated models. And about 15 years and 3 generations of standards were developed there. Now, what I'm going to be talking about is the third era of internet identity, which is broadly called decentralized. And it's inspired by blockchain technology. The two key standards, decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials, are there, and those are the bodies that are primarily involved with that. So I'm going to do this fairly quickly and start out by just saying what is really driving the interest in this new model. And it is that it takes the very old model we've been talking about here that John started out with of physical identity documents, and says we can finally do those online. We can literally put them on the mobile devices we're carrying with us and have digital wallets. Most smartphones have those, of course, today, but those are proprietary wallets from those vendors. We're now talking about open standard wallets in which you can take digital credentials. And the heart of that is what's broadly referred to as the trust triangle. All credentials, physical or digital, have issuers. They go to holders, they go into their wallet, and then they're presented to what we call verifiers, such as a passport at an airport to get onto a plane. If we want that all to work digitally, the answer is cryptography. You need to digitally encrypt and sign the credentials, and they need to be signed also by the holder of the credential when they're presented. So that's, and then the piece in the very center there, the verifiable data registry, that's the key to how we do this in a decentralized way, as I'll explain. Now, you might look at this and say, well, what's the user experience like? Anyone listening to this conference who's used a mobile boarding pass for a plane knows exactly what that experience is like. It really can be very simple, as easy as using literally your physical wallet. It's mostly done with QR codes, though it doesn't have to be. So let's dive down here to understand a little bit what are these, give me some real examples of what's happening with these new verifiable digital credentials. First one is highly topical. Everton's actually working on this with IATA. It's called the Travel Pass, and it is exactly what Jan was just talking about, the digital version of a travel credential that in this case will be able to share information about your COVID testing or soon vaccinations, in order that you'll be able to board a plane and cross borders that have specific requirements around that. Again, it's if you're getting vaccinated today, my wife just got vaccinated last week, you get a little piece of paper. It's trivial to forge. This is going to be bound to your identity, to your digital phone, to your wallet, and it's going to be much stronger credential. Another example that's also in production today, NHS is the National Health Service in the UK that Emma lives in. They are the 5th largest employer in the world. They have to move doctors and nurses around between many different facilities, 2,500 facilities in the UK. And it currently takes several hours of paperwork to move someone. They want to cut that down to minutes. And they're doing it with, again, a verifiable credential of being a doctor or nurse. Another example we have here is starting in the US. Exchanging information about your own healthcare records. Verifiable credentials allows that to be done. You see the patient in the center receiving a credential of their information directly to their smartphone, and then being able to share it wherever they need to do that in a highly secure and privacy respecting way. The data does not sit in a central database. It is in the hands and the phone of the patient. So it can literally travel with them and yet still be secure and verifiable information. And the last example I'll give you is also in the financial services, KYC, AML, all of these are requirements that they all have to deal with. The credit unions, financial cooperatives in the US and Canada have started a project, and it's using a single standardized digital credential of credit union membership called the Member Pass. Over 20 credit unions are now issuing these. Over 30,000 have been issued, and they expect to get up into the millions this year. So this is what's actually happening out there in the market. I'm going to quickly explain. So how did this actually work? And I'm just going to step through this in a simple diagram so you see how we that infrastructure that Jan talked about. How does it actually conceptually work? So you have the trust triangle there with a digital wallet for the holder in the middle. Now, the key role at the bottom of a verifiable data registry, that's the term, which is often doesn't have to be a blockchain, is that the issuer, and I'm going to use the IoT travel pass as an example here. The issuer in this case is going to be a lab or a healthcare facility. And it starts by registering a public key on, in this case, it's the sovereign blockchain. That's a worldwide blockchain designed just for self-sovereign identity. And the address of that public key and that cryptographic data there is called a DID, decentralized identifier. That's a W3C standard that I've been working on for the last 5 years, and it's almost complete. It should be fully done next month. And once the lab has done that, the next step is now they can issue a verifiable credential. In this case, it's the IOTA travel pass, and to a traveler. Now, with the private key, of course, when the public key, they digitally sign that travel pass, and that's what goes into the wallet of the holder, such as their smartphone. Now, the traveler now can present, when asked, a proof of that credential to the verifier, that being something like the airline. And that's always done by consent by the traveler, so it can be fully regulatory compliant. That proof will have the DID of the issuer, so the airline is able to read off the blockchain in a very decentralized system the public key, and now do the verification of the digital signature on that data. And the key to all this is that as long as the verifier trusts the issuer, the entire thing works without any direct connection between the verifier and the issuer, as is required with federated technology. So this decentralizes the whole system by use of decentralized PKI. That's what the blockchain portion is doing. Now, in this design, I want to be very clear. We have worked hard on building in privacy by design. And I want to really emphasize that even though in the lower portion of this, you see the use of public DIDs and public blockchains, that we have a way of avoiding that when you're talking about these direct connections. And that's whenever you're creating a relationship, such as between the holder and the issuer here, that uses a different type of DID called a peer DID. And that's basically exchange of public keys and DIDs and public keys between the two parties, that then each party can rotate their keys and keep the connection going. When the holder turns around and is going to connect with the verifier, a different set of peer DIDs are created, so that you have entirely separate secure private channels that can be used for anything, not just verifiable credential exchange. Now, in this architecture, that means everything above this line takes place fully off chain, and it's completely GDPR compliant. In fact, there's a wonderful feature where if the holder wants to exercise the right of erasure on either of these relationships, they can send a digitally signed auditable message about exactly what they want erased or corrected on either side. So this is, I want to reinforce when people talk about how is blockchain used for self-sovereign identity, it's only used down at the area where we're doing the decentralized public key infrastructure. It is not used, and in fact, you don't want to use it in the upper layer where you're talking about the direct private exchange of digital credentials that have sensitive data, such as the health data on the travel pass. All right, I'll make just a couple more points here. Biometrics do fit into this, but it's really quite simple to explain how that's done. Same picture, but what they are is simply another type of credential. And the beauty is that credential can actually be produced locally at the device, such as the facial recognition or fingerprint recognition, voice recognition that a smartphone can do today, or it can be done remotely with a biometric service provider, but both in a privacy respecting way. Now, In this infrastructure, there is a very special role. We've been talking technology the whole time, but the other half of the equation is governance frameworks. And I want to explain this role. Classic example. When you have the trust triangle for a credential, how do all the verifiers trust the issuers if you want to scale this? Well, that problem's actually been widely solved in existing physical credentials by adding what we call the governance trust triangle here at the bottom. And what's broadly called a trust framework or a governance framework. Blockchain folks tend to prefer the latter term. And there's a wonderful example today. You have with the credit card networks. You have a network like MasterCard will authorize all of the banks and financial institutions that can issue a credential known as a credit card or debit card to cardholders who can present that credential to merchants to pay for merchandise. What we're doing now with the infrastructure I'm talking about in the open standards is making that model available to any trust community of any size anywhere. For example, IATA Travel Pass. IATA, the International Air Travel Association, is the governance authority. They are building a registry to authorize labs throughout the world, national labs and other systems. They in turn will issue the verifiable credentials, the travel pass credentials to travelers who can now present proof of it to airlines, all based on a governance authority. So, I mean, a governance framework that works for the entire system. So lastly, what I'll cover is this set of standards is now being consolidated into an overall stack of what we call the Trustovp IP Foundation that launched in May. It now has over 140 organizations. This is what it looks like. It's a 4-layer stack. And notice there's a technology stack on the right, but there's a parallel governance stack. There are governance frameworks for each of these 4 layers. And here's why. Infrastructure like this is all large-scale technology infrastructure follows these same 4 layers. In fact, our ground transportation infrastructure does exactly this. If you look at it, we wouldn't have, you have to have ground transportation systems. You have to have the roads and highways. They're public utilities. They take a lot of investment to build and maintain for everyone. But to travel those, you have to have private vehicles of all different types and sizes, and that's an open market. But you still don't have something that's usable unless you turn around and decide how are you going to coordinate everything so it works safely on that infrastructure. And only when you have that layer can you finally have the application layer where you deliver the different systems and services. And notice we've even digitized transportation with services like Uber. So what we're doing with Trustovp IP is applying the same thing to our digital data transportation infrastructure. That's why the 4 layers, the verifiable data registries, the blockchains, or other similar systems at layer 1 and their governance. At layer 2, we have the interoperable open standard digital wallets and agents, such as those smartphones I talked about. They can also be in the cloud. And we set governance for the security and privacy data protection needed by those at that layer. 3rd layer is the trust triangle. This is where all the different kinds of credentials, the different trust communities are needed, and the corresponding governance framework, so you know the policies under which those are being issued and verified. And all of that supports layer 4, which is now entire digital trust ecosystems. And at the Trustovp IP Foundation, we have dozens of them now appearing. Healthcare, travel, transportation. They're saying, we finally have an overall infrastructure for scalable, transitive digital trust, and we're very excited about it. And I think I got that done in 10 minutes, Gilead. I hope so.
Close enough. No problem. Thank you for that very comprehensive explanation. And now let's go to our final speaker, Emma Lindley, who's going to discuss the commercial dimensions of digital identity.
Thanks very much, Gilad. Before the internet, of course, it was possible to prove identity, and often the parties were known to each other already, so the process was relatively easy and the cost was relatively low. Since the introduction of the internet and remote transactions means the ways that identity can be proven, the cost of proving that identity, and therefore the market size of identity services, has increased exponentially. And there is a cost to the value chain and in the value chain of delivering identity services. Jan's covered it, Drummond covered it in the last session. There are a lot of legal, technical service and support of these systems, and there is a cost to that, which has to be borne somewhere within the ecosystem. And how that cost is dealt with is different from country to country, and that depends on a multitude of different factors, from the political through to the legal through to the social. For example, if identity is seen as a public good, then the government might deliver that service for free to its citizens, and then recoup it through taxes, the payment for that service. If the government doesn't do that, then how does that market get, and how does the market get serviced? Well, then the reality of it is the private sector might fill in. Now, this might be with the government support. There might be some kind of public-private sector partnership, or it could not be with the government support, and it might just be private sector companies providing identity services within a particular ecosystem. So, for example, in the UK, I'm here in the UK, so I'll give that example. We don't actually have a government-provided identity service that everybody can use, that's fit for purpose. We don't even have, Jan was talking about an identity document. We don't even have an identity document that everybody has. So in this case, many of the services relating to identity in the UK are delivered through the private sector. Now, if we look at the other side of the market, so I talked a little bit about the supply side of the market and how that might work, and some of the market dynamics. Now, if we look at the other side of the market, the demand side, there are a huge amount of market drivers, and there is a need and demand for organisations to verify identity. Drummond's just covered some of those off. It might be organisations in financial services, companies trying to comply with regulation around know your customer checks, or it could be a government trying to prevent fraud through people trying to access benefits. They want to make sure those benefits get to the right people. Or it could be a healthcare provider trying to ensure they don't vaccinate the same person twice. And there's lots of examples. Now, as I said earlier, historically, these checks would be done manually and in person. But as we have all moved to a more remote way of delivering these things, it's no longer possible to do them potentially in an efficient way, if at all possible. Now, the private sector market of identity services for individuals, and there is identity services for businesses, but I'm not going to go into that today. I'm going to talk to you about individuals, can be roughly split into two component parts. Identity for consumers, which we call customer identity and access management, consumer identity and access management, and identity for what we call the enterprise, and that is organizations. So those are verifying the identities of the individuals that work for companies, and we call that IAM, identity and access management. Now, those two rough markets can be split again into three segments. If you can imagine, it's almost like a six-pack. And within each one of those rough two markets, they have these three segments. They have three domains: the identification domain, where you're actually trying to take the real world identity and validate it. And, is Emma Lindley the Emma Lindley that's presenting herself to be Emma Lindley? Then we have the authentication domain, the second domain, which is where we are trying to establish that it is Emma Lindley coming back to use the service. And the authorization domain, which is essentially giving access to various products or services. Now, there are many, many companies operating in all of these spaces. They're not necessarily operating in all of them. There are companies just operating in the identification domain, some just in the authentication domain, and some just in the authorization domain. And it really does just depend. And they're essentially building services, and I'll give you an example. You might have a company working in the identification domain. There's lots of companies: GBG, PLC, Experian, LexisNexis, and they have built services which just directly replicate the Know Your Customer process. And this could be simply electronically checking a series of databases to check if that person exists on those databases with simply a yes or no response. On the demand side, a financial services firm would pay for that because it means they don't have to ask the person to come into a branch. It's quicker for the individual and it removes paper out of the process. The customer gets access to the bank account, the product, when they get through the identity service. Now, we call this identity proofing. It sits in the identification domain, and there's lots of market demand and money that's made within that space. There would be a contract between the identity proofing provider and the financial services provider, bound by a set of terms and conditions and legal frameworks and so on. At the other end of the spectrum, there are organizations providing identity, for example, the big tech firms, for example, like Facebook. This is where a Facebook user might be offered the option to log in using a service, using single sign-on, Facebook Connect. This sits a bit more in the authentication domain, but data is passed about the individual to the service provider. So some of the money that's being made in the market is done with some more clarity, and perhaps some of the money that's being made in the market is a little bit more opaque. And just lastly, my final remark is that there are not that many models where the end user pays money for identity services. There are some, but these are the exception and not the rule. And it's possible that we'll see potentially more users want to pay for identity in the future, but that model presupposes that people understand what identity is and the value of it. One such value, of course, could be the desire for increased privacy. Thanks, Gilad.
Thank you very much, Emma. Thank you all of the speakers for your excellent remarks. A very diverse set of information covering a lot of ground going back hundreds of years to the most cutting edge technology. Thank you for such a comprehensive look. So I have lots of questions. There are some questions also in the chat, but I'm going to start with keying off of Emma's final points about cost, because I believe that when we consider the identity papers from the eras that John Torpey was talking about, they were being issued internally by the state. And so there wasn't, John, correct me if I'm wrong, there wasn't really a commercial dimension to it. It was an extension of the administration functions of the state to its people. Is that accurate? John, you are muted.
So sometimes until the 20th century, I mean, these wasn't really a commercial dimension in the sense that you mean, but you know, consuls in foreign countries were often business people who were, you know, held in high regard by somebody in the American government and given the duty of issuing, you know, passports and things like that, until the Rogers Act of 1923 professionalized the international civil service and took that kind of thing out of the hands of private actors and lodged it in the hands of government officials.
So Jan and Drummond, your presentations also sort of talk about cost. Well, certainly Jan's had discussed it directly, but Drummond, the cost, where do the costs emerge and who covers them in the SSI model that you described?
It's an extremely good question. I think the market is going to broadly divide into the primary costs are with the issuers, as Emma said, the identity proofing necessary to produce trust in the claims or attributes going into those digital credentials. And we're finding that issuers have sort of two models. One is they sort of call it the open source model, where they're saying there are enough complementary benefits that we're going to do this work, and then we're going to give that data over to the individual in the case of personal identity, and we're going to see the benefits from them either using it back with us or with others, and you know, sort of carrying our brand and our trust with it. There are other issuers that are in the business of sort of deeper proofing, for instance, background check companies, right, or credit rating companies, where they're paid for that data currently, and this is essentially a new distribution channel the challenge with this channel is how they get paid for it, and companies like Evernym are actively working on that. There's sort of conventional models of how you route it, but there's also a digital value exchange using digital currencies of various kinds. So in essence, my answer is Emma is exactly right. The value flow is still there. It's just being done digitally and hopefully with a much broader, larger efficiency over many more claims that are relevant to digital identity.
Well, and so Jan, in the case of the German EID, when one considers this spectrum, this question, is identity a public good or a commercial service? In the German case, it is a public good. Would you agree?
Yes, generally yes, but I think both dimensions are there. If you consider that the digital ID, even if issued by the state, is also used in the context of businesses. I mean, there is a certain commercial dimension to it then. But we started out from, let's say, the travel document, the border control ID, and also from the government ID. So from there, it's an more infrastructural approach, I would say. But we wanted to include all. But it also makes it more difficult, and it produces dependencies.
And so the Germany ID is funded through a direct fee by the citizenry, like a kind of a tax, and then I assume subsidized by the German government?
Well, there are different areas. Of course, as a citizen, you pay for the card every 10 years when you get it, and so there are costs which are covered by this. And if you want to use it as a business, basically you have to have a certain title to use it, and you have to pay a provider to provide you with the certain technical means. And of course, this is something with the businesses then.
So, and then I wanted to ask Emma, can you tell us anything about how the commercial markets for identity interact with national forms of electronic identity like the German EID?
I mean, it's highly fragmented, so it depends from market to market. But if again, I'll take the UK. And there is a piece of legislation across Europe which is called the EIDAS, which is seeking to try and harmonise the way that identities can work interoperably across Europe. But if I look at the UK, for example, we have in the UK built something which is called the Document Checking Service. The government has built this as a service. And so private sectors, and it is in a pilot at the moment, private sector organisations, I think the pilot finishes July of this year, private sector organisations pay, they integrate to it, identity companies, they integrate to this through an API, this service, and then they then can provide a service out to, for example, a bank, or a bank could integrate to it directly to this service and validate things like passports and driving licenses. The government is charging for that service. It just gives a yes/no response. So it's not actually giving back any data about the individual. The data is provided as part of perhaps a bank opening process, a KYC process, know your customer process, and then the service gives back a yes/no response. But then that is validated and the government is charging for that.
And so that is validation of official documentation, I take it, that there would...
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes, against the official database. It's validated against the official passport and driving license database in the UK.
And so, Drummond, would one of the, I guess, okay, it seems to me that the onboarding process of the SSI model is still going to rely on existing lines of official documentation. Is that accurate?
Yes, with an asterisk, meaning the initial issuance of digital credentials, verifiable digital credentials, is going to have to totally, of course, bootstrap itself from the existing processes, as Emma was referring to, right, for identity proofing, and the costs that they involve, depending on the assurance level you're after. What will start to change is that as we start having, digital wallets with those credentials, the identity proofing process subsequently for other issuers can start to become more efficient because they can more quickly and accurately check those original documents. So there's always going to be some level of real world identity proofing that has to happen, especially to reach the higher level assurance levels. And just like you have to renew your passport every 5 or 10 years, depending on national laws, that's still going to be happening, but you're going to be building up this asset in the form of, just as I built up this, the credentials in this physical wallet, I'm going to be building up the credentials in this wallet. And as I do that, it's going to become easier and easier. And my wallet-based reputation is going to get stronger and stronger. And that's also why privacy is so important, because this really becomes a tremendous digital asset for individuals and also organizations. I want to make it clear, this new, digital identity applies to organizations. There's the Global Legal Identity Identifier Foundation, GLIFE, that issues international identifiers for legal entities, businesses of any kind. They're now introducing the VLEI, verifiable credentials for that, and therefore organizations and the employees and directors that work for them are all going to be able to digitally sign to prove they're acting on behalf of a registered legal entity in any business transaction in the world. So that's also going to be a driver for the adoption of these new digital IDs.
So you're suggesting that the digital IDs themselves will become breeder documents?
That's exactly the term. I don't know how long that will take. And of course, that's where, to Jan's point, it took a long time. I remember when I was working on the Information Card Foundation over 10 years ago. At that point, the German government was like, nope, we're not going there. We were trying to convince them that they should support information cards, which were sort of an early version of what we now call verifiable credentials. And it was just not something that they were comfortable with at that time. Obviously, things moved down the road, but I think we're going to need to see legislative support, regulatory support, and it will grow slowly over time. You can't rush things when it comes to trust infrastructure like that.
Well, that's a perfect segue because I wanted to ask all of you about the concept of trust. It's a term that is thrown around with an expectation that people knows what it means, like love. But I suspect that, like love, people mean different things by it. And in all of your presentations, I've either heard the word trust or something close to it, and it all had very potentially different orientations. And so I wanted to talk about the variability of the definition of trust in this environment, if anybody wants to jump in on that.
I think it's completely subjective. I think that word is completely subjective. And so just to your point, Gilad, you will have heard us all say the word trust or something similar. Drummond talked about the Trust in IP Foundation. The interesting thing about, the space that we operate in, and, when we talk about beauty being in the eye of the beholder, the trust is also in the eye of the beholder as well. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we have, particularly with terminology in the space that we work in. And so when we use words like trust, and I talk about myself in this as well, it is getting down to actually what each party means by that is really the crux of the matter.
Other comments, please.
Well, I guess I would just say simply that, in a certain sense, there's an inherent lack of trust built into all these documents. That is to say that, there was a time when, we didn't have this kind of government at a distance that I referred to. And people were expected to be able to produce somebody who was going to vouch for them. And now that's all been moved into, documents that are produced by some of the agencies discussed or represented even here in our panel. But, of course, the documents on the one hand, are supposed to say, well, this is the person who they say they are. But then there's always in these kinds of arrangements where documents are required, there's an element of fraud. Because somebody has an interest in producing counterfeit documents that somebody else who needs them can't get for some reason, and then there's a market for that. So I think there's a way in which trust has migrated into the citizen-government relationship, but it's by no means, something that everybody takes for granted. People scrutinize documents at the airport, for example, to try to figure out, is this person really, who they say they are? And where is Rhodesia anyway? So, people who work for airlines are put in the position of having to, vouchsafe that this document is what it says it is, but they don't really know where Rhodesia is and that it went out of existence 40 years ago. So in any case, I think, as Emma said, the trust question is a difficult one.
I was going to say that, Jan, when you mentioned trust, you mentioned it in terms of citizen government trust, that the citizens must trust in the documents. But is that true? Do they have a choice?
Well, I think that's the reason why you have to build something they also trust in, because the state document basically is something, especially if you have an obligation to have one, it's something you can only get from the state or have to get it even from the state. And in a democratic society, I think, then you have to build in a way that it meets a reasonable expectation of the citizen at that point as well. And of course, if you build an ID to distribute ID information of the citizen to parties, then you have to meet this requirement of the citizen that you're not throwing around their data to somewhere. I mean, this is a legal requirement, of course, to the state. But yeah, I mean, trust is always something that builds because things work the way you want to have it to work, and at least in a relationship between state and citizen. And for that reason, I think if you are designing such a system, you have to take care of such questions.
Okay. There's a question a couple of questions in the chat that are sort of dancing around similar issues, which is to the decentralized architecture model, a sort of general questions of what happens if you lose your phone, and then the potential danger of including biometrics within that environment.
Cool. The two most frequent and juiciest questions. Let me quickly take the first one. I'm going to hold up these two, two wallets, and ask you which one do you think is going to be safer over time, right? Which one would you rather lose? I'm going to tell you in a heartbeat, I'd rather lose this one, because this one is a lot of work to replace, and there's no such thing as a backup. This one is going to be, I don't know of a digital wallet manufacturer today that's not doing automatic encrypted backup. So if you lose your phone and it's done right, you could literally have a new phone and have your wallet restored in a few hours. So that's got to be built in. And it just simply, there's no, no choice about doing that. With biometrics, that's an extremely good, rich, deep topic. The short answer I would give you is, basically never put biometrics on any publicly accessible system. Don't even put them in encrypted. Don't touch a blockchain with them. Ideally, they stay locally on the device so that you're only producing evidence from the device. Again, that's why we talked about it as another form of a credential. And if you want to do them remotely, you need an extremely privacy respecting protocol for biometric service providers. Such things have been developed. IEEE has a standard for them, and just proceed with caution.
So are you suggesting that the inclusion of biometrics in the SSI domain is not ready for prime time because we don't have enough trustable actors?
Well, the biometric companies are really focused in on it because they know that the more digital you get, the more remote you get, the more important biometric identification becomes. So I would say what I'm seeing out there is actually getting very robust solutions that are now being, the biggest issue is privacy. And so it's that ability to trust that the biometric is being used in a highly privacy respecting manner and testing that. And that's peer review. And that's even, ultimately legislative approval is what it's going to take.
And so, Jan, in the German case, the biometrics that are stored on the EID are the face and optionally the fingerprints. And you have a model that, a technical architecture that essentially locks down the use of the biometrics. Is that correct? Can they be used in a commercial model?
That's correct, and no, they are currently not foreseen for a commercial model. They're foreseen, of course, for border controls and, well, required by law identifications. Let's say if you have a police officer controlling you, and they're foreseen also for this real life scenarios when you actually have the opportunity to check the original, let's say, fingerprint against the fingerprint in the document. So we don't want to use it. We don't wanted to have it transferred because on this direct check, it's hard to do also in an online context.
Okay, we have 2 minutes left, so I wanted to ask the panelists if they could all just give a couple of closing sentences about what they think this evolution, this multi-century evolution of the practice of identification, how it is evolving, is it a good thing, and any other final thoughts?
That's a tough one.
You have 15 seconds.
I mean, what I was struck by when I was drafting my remarks was the sense, and maybe it's only a sense, was of the fact that, governments, it seemed to me, have, they want to know who you are, they want to get their taxes from you, etc. But they have a more limited interest, it seems to me, than private entities who are trying to figure out, what keystrokes you make, how frequently, things that the government, I don't think, generally speaking, unless they suspect you of a crime, isn't really interested in. But these private entities, insofar as we live in a world of surveillance capitalism, want to know everything they can possibly know about you to figure out what to sell you.
Okay. Final remarks.
One wish.
Yes.
Keep it clean and simple, please, because we have to manage our identity, and I want to have it clean and simple. Thanks. Fair
enough. And last sentence.
I'll say one thing, Gilead. What I described is coming. The plan is for tens of millions of these travel passes to be issued by the end of this year, and hundreds of millions within the next 2 years, because we're going to need them to reopen global travel. So it's coming, like it or not.
Final word, Emma?
We need more, I think, standards, and we because effectively technology is taking over from from the standards that are set. So I think we just need to see more standards in our space.
Thank you, everyone, for such excellent presentations. Very, very informative session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Gilad.